Hi everyone, welcome to the October 25th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, instead of taking a look at the upcoming weekend races, we're going to look a week ahead to the Breeders' Cup Saturday races. As you might remember on the TimeformUS Pacecast, on Tuesday, we talked about the Breeders' Cup Friday races, all of the two-year-old action. And today we're going to talk about the 9 races scheduled for Saturday. We're just going to go through them all in chronological order, not putting out concrete opinions at this point, just trying to give an overview of all of the races. You, of course, can get advanced PPs for these races on DRF.com, either the classic DRF PPs, or you can look into the TimeformUS Breeders' Cup package, where you can get advanced PPs as well as the official PPs when the races are drawn next week. And in-depth analysis from me and Craig, as well as some Euro analysis, some write-ups on the pace projectors. So look for all of that later next week if you're interested in the TimeformUS Breeders' Cup package. Craig, how are you doing? Ready to go through these races?
I am. Actually, finally took a really good close look at them after the pre-entries came out. I believe it was on Tuesday or Wednesday. So have formed some early opinions. Of course, they're always adjustable. We got to see post-draw and where all these horses are actually gonna head. Some of the races are a little confusing at this point until that is known for sure. But I definitely think there is some good stuff to talk about.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I've just taken a preliminary look at a lot of these. I haven't really formed set opinions yet. I've really got to do a deep dive after this, but I have some ideas about how the races are going to shape up. And we'll start with the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint, which is the first Breeders' Cup race that's scheduled for Saturday. And this race has been billed as a matchup between the two, the older horse and the 3-year-old filly, Come Dancing and Kofefi. I find it interesting. I think a good place to start in this race is just taking a look at the pace projector because, unsurprisingly, like many of the sprint races for the Breeders' Cup, this one is predicted to feature a fast pace. But what really strikes me about looking at this pace projector is how far back Come Dancing is placed. And I know we had talked about on the TimeformUS Pacecast in prior weeks, coming out of her performances, that she's a horse who breaks slowly and doesn't always have that electrifying early speed that Kofefi's shown. But it still surprised me that there were so many horses that are predicted to be ahead of her in the early going.
Yeah, the pace was the first thing that jumped out at me. And I mean, one thing you got to keep in mind is this is a 7-furlong race. And that can be problematic for those speed horses. Kofefi is obviously probably the horse to beat in here. I imagine she'll be the clear favorite. She's run the best figures this year outside of that Come Dancing figure early in the year, which is at least a little bit questionable how legit that is. But I think she could be vulnerable. The 7-furlong distance and the other speed in here could be trouble for her. And being further back than normal might not be as big an issue for Come Dancing, especially given her gait issues.
No, I agree with that. I think what's really going to be important for Come Dancing is the post position draw, because if she draws an inside post position and breaks slowly and is kind of locked in inside behind a lot of horses, that's going to be a pretty tough situation for her. But if she is posted towards the outside and she breaks a little slowly and can just gradually work her way into the race, as she did in the Ballerina at Saratoga, that might not be so bad for her. I don't know what we're going to get from Come Dancing. She reportedly had that amazing workout last week where she went 6 furlongs in 1:10-1 over the Belmont training track. I know a lot of local people were buzzing about that workout. She reportedly went the 5 furlongs in 56 and then just sort of galloped out the 6 furlongs. She's obviously very fast, but Kofefi has been just amazing in a couple of her 7-furlong races, the Test and the Dogwood last time. And I agree with you. Kofefi's probably going to be a big favorite in this race. In my opinion, she's going to be really hard to beat, even though there is other speed in this spot. I will be a little bit surprised if somebody else wins this race. I mean, just looking through it, the 2 other horses that I thought would be most dangerous, Serengeti Empress and Secret Spice, they're both entered with first preference as the Distaff. So I think the quality just drops off a bit when you get to the others that are really intended for this race.
The one horse I would throw in, I tried to add a price horse that I like in each of these races we're going to talk about, is Bellafina. I'll be honest, I kind of written her off after the Test. I figured, she's just not the same horse. But I was actually pretty impressed with her cotillion. The pace that day was pretty insane. It's about as fast as you'll ever see on our pace figures for a dirt route at a distance, which was only 1 1/16, I think it was. And she actually made a big move, made the lead, and just kind of hung around. She was fourth, beaten 9 lengths, but I think the turnback's going to be good for her. It was good to see her run a good race outside of California. So if I had to throw in one other, it would be her. I do agree with you about Secret Spice. I think this would be a much better spot for her. I don't think she wants any parts of a 1.125, but it looks like for now she's pointed to the Distaff. Serengeti Empress also has first preference in the Distaff. We'll talk about that one later, but I think that's probably actually a better choice for her.
Yeah, Bellafina is an interesting horse because people had always said that she might be one that doesn't ship well. I hadn't really agreed with that in the past. But, I mean, you do look at her PPs, and it is kind of striking that all of her good races are out in California, and she is getting to start in California for this race. So, I mean, maybe that works in her favor. I still think she has to improve a bit, and I'm assuming you do too. But she is going to be a decent price in this race. I'm not going to argue with anything you had to say about her. Let's move on to the turf sprint. This race is just a big headache for me. I tried to get through this field, and I mean, there are a lot of contenders, even some contenders that are stuck on the also eligible list. It's hard to even know really where to start because it doesn't seem like there's a clear favorite in this race. I mean, the local horse, Eddie Haskell, I guess he's one that you have to consider. We've talked about him for a long time as being a really good fit for this race because it's run over the 5 furlongs at Santa Anita, and that really does seem to be his specialty. It's just, I guess with Eddie Haskell, the question is, can he handle the step up in class?
Yeah, it's an interesting field. I was going to start with Stormy Liberal since he's a 2-time defending champion in this race. But I do think he's lost a step. He just hasn't quite been the same horse this year as he had in prior years. It's not going to shock me if he throws in a top effort and wins this race. If memory serves, he didn't look all that great last year coming in. He was solid enough, but I'm going to be playing against him. I agree with you that Eddie Haskell is one of the horses to beat in here. And I'm going to lean towards the local horses, the California horses. I think they're probably the quickest. That would include Eddie Haskell. Even Belvoir Bay, who we haven't seen recently. She's been off after running, I believe it was the Jaipur on Belmont Stakes weekend. Might have been Belmont Day, I think it was, or day before. And I respect the mare. She's been great at 5 furlongs. She's never been worse than second in 5 trips around that distance. And I also am even going to, just because of Peter Miller, I think Ohm's got a shot. He's been running okay. He hasn't been seen in a while, but he's run well in this race before, was just nosed out by obviously before. So if he shows up in here, I would give him a puncher's chance as well.
Yeah, I think the distance of this race is really important to discuss, and you were alluding to it when you were saying that the local California horses might have the edge here. In Belvoir Bay, she's one that has handled the 5 furlongs in the past and looks pretty dangerous. I agree with what you said about Stormy Liberal. I mean, he was coming into this race last year in better form, and his recent races at Del Mar and Kentucky Downs and Santa Anita, he's lost them all. Actually, his last win was in this race last year, and he just hasn't run those speed figures that would really put him at the level to be competitive in this race this year. Maybe he takes a big step forward for Peter Miller on the big day. I'm just not quite seeing it. And I mean, the horse you mentioned, Ohm, is interesting because he does have the class to be successful in this race, but he was successful going the 6.5 down the hill at Santa Anita. He doesn't strike me as a horse that's really a 5 furlong type because he can even go the mile. And I'm just not quite sure that he's got the speed to win going this distance or to even overcome the fact that he's going to be so far behind in the early going. So he's a horse I don't really know what to do with. Of the East Coast horses, I mean, I think Imprimis is a little bit interesting because he did have that trip last time, the Woodford, where he just couldn't really get clear in the stretch until it was too late. He was just kind of unlucky that day. He is really this 5 furlong type of horse. So I wouldn't be shocked if he transfers his form just fine to the Santa Anita course. And also pure sensation. I mean, I know we talked about him being a Parks horse that just runs well in Pennsylvania, but he is this 5 furlong kind of horse. I mean, even the 5.5 seems like it's too far for him sometimes. So I'm not going to be shocked if his speed actually translates pretty well to this turf sprint.
No, he's solid. I mean, at 8 years old, we've talked about it. He's good at the distance everywhere. He just seems to run a little bit better at Parks. And, this is a race where you really got to look at post-draw. You got to see what kind of odds you're going to get. And this is probably the most unpredictable race we're going to see. I don't know if I could tell you with any certainty who I even think is going to be the favorite in here. Maybe it'll be Eddie Haskell, maybe not. We're sure to see plenty of speed, but, I do think you have to have some early speed. A lot of people kind of gravitate towards a closer in these situations, but at 5 furlongs, that's pretty dangerous. Closers tend to get shuffled back. They don't have room. They have to swing wide because the horses aren't really tiring. You aren't going to get a lot of horses drifting well off the rail. They're going to hold their position, so the closers are really at a disadvantage here. So I'm going to be looking for tactical speed, and the post draw is going to play a big part in who I bet here.
Yeah, totally. This race really is all about the trips. Let's move on to the next one. The dirt mile. This is probably going to end up being one of the smaller fields that we see because while there are a ton of free entries for this race, it seems like a lot of horses are entered with first preference as being another race. Some of them are entered in the mile. Some of them are also entered in the sprint. So while there are 15 pre-entries, it seems like this could go off with a field of no more than 9 horses. And I know there have been some buzz years ago about the potential of adding a Breeders' Cup Derby for the 3-year-olds. And while this race is open to the older horses, this does kind of have a Derby feel to it because, I mean, the main players are all 3-year-olds. Omaha Beach is obviously the main story, but you've also got Improbable and Mr. Money, who really did some nice work after the Triple Crown season. Though Omaha Beach seems like the favorite, and if he takes the kind of step forward that most people assume he will, he's probably going to be pretty tough in here.
He is. Like you said, it's kind of a rematch of back at Oaklawn, even the Arkansas Derby, the Rebel, though I don't think Improbable faced Omaha Beach in the Rebel. They ran in those split divisions, but they were both there and ran well. I'm like you. I think the race goes through Omaha Beach. I didn't spend as much time on this one because we just don't know who's in the field. 6 of the horses actually have a first preference in the sprint. Seeing how tough that one came up, maybe a few will gravitate out of there. We got some horses that didn't draw in initially, but they're probably going to get in as some of those horses defect. Snappy Sinclair is one whose first preference is the mile, but he's not getting in that field. I think he's actually the last horse chosen, so he'll probably run here. So I would guess all the horses are going to get in. Again, it goes through Omaha Beach. I kind of liken this race to the horse racing version of the NIT in basketball, where it's just kind of the horses don't really want to be in the classic. They're not really sprinters, so it's just kind of the leftover. Good betting race, not one I'm super excited about. The one horse I do like at a price is Spun the Run. We talked about him on the Pacecast a few weeks ago. He ran that really fast race at Parks. And I'm sure we just saw Bone Raison come back at Belmont out of that race and win at a big price in a 5-horse field. So I do think that was a strong race, and the runbacks are kind of backing that up. So he's another 3-year-old that could offer some value in here. Improbable's one I'm just not sure what to do with. I think he's going to be a short price. And at short prices, I never want horses that make their own trouble. And he just seems to be one of those that finds a way to do it. If you go back to his race 2 back in California, where he ran pretty well, it was a short field. I guess you could make a case for him, but I've just seen too much of his annex to be too excited about him, and I'm going to look elsewhere.
Yeah, we pretty much agree on that. I'm also interested in Spun to Run. We talked about his last race at Parks on one of the recent podcasts. I think we're both really impressed by that race. And it remains to be seen if he can translate that kind of form out to California. But if he can, he's going to be a handful. The horse that I'd be kind of against that might take some money in this race is Cold Front, who just hasn't really stepped forward, in my opinion, since coming back from Dubai. I know he got the win at Parks last time. That was not the strongest field, and there's other speed in this race, so he's one that I just wasn't that interested in. I mean, if I was going to take a look at one of the older horses, it might be Giant Expectations, who actually ran pretty well behind Catalina Cruiser last time in the Pat O'Brien. I also thought he ran well 2 back. I know against New York breds, but Pat on the Back, who beat him, is an open company kind of horse. And Giant Expectations actually had trouble at the start that day, as he's wont to do, but it was a big excuse for him. So he's one that I would consider if I was looking for a horse to come from off the pace. But I pretty much agree with how you sorted out the 3-year-olds. I think it is mostly about them, with Omaha Beach leading the charge.
Yeah, I do want to say we didn't even mention Mr. Money, who's probably going to take a bit of money in here. I did forget to look at your morning line for this race, so I'm not sure where you pegged him. He's a horse I'm really not sure what to do with. I think we're going to have to see the post draw and the odds, but I'm kind of against him compared to a horse like Omaha Beach or even Spun to Run.
Yeah, our colleague Brad Free actually did the morning line for the Saturday races, and I think he has Mr. Money as one of the favorites, about 5-1. So yeah, I do think he's one of the horses that's going to take some money in this spot, and a mile is the right distance for him. So I'm not going to totally discount him. I just think I agree. He's got to get a little better to beat Omaha Beach. Let's head on to the filly and mare turf. Back to the turf, and Sister Charlie, she's the big name attraction in this race, although I think a lot of the people that were planning to single her kind of got thrown for a loop when Aidan O'Brien announced that Magical, who looked like she might be one of the top contenders for the Breeders' Cup Turf, she's listed as second preference for the filly and mare turf. All of Aidan O'Brien's quotations in the media have said that she's actually targeting this filly and mare turf, and it really does turn this race into a two-horse affair. I mean, some people might say that it's still Sister Charlie's race to lose, but I don't know about that. Magical's really good, and if she can continue to hold her form, because she's just run so many times recently, it seems like she's in action every 2 weeks over in Europe. But I mean, she seems like one of these iron horses that just it doesn't really phase her. And if she can bring that kind of form that we saw in the Champion Stakes and the Irish Champion Stakes in recent weeks over to the United States, then she's going to be a really tough foe for Sister Charlie.
She is. I think this would probably be the most exciting head-to-head matchup we'd have on the day, the one that would have people really talking. I mean, you just have two horses in great form. As you said, O'Brien has indicated that he would prefer this race, or that's where she's going to be pointed. My one real pause for concern with Magical, in addition to, as you mentioned, how often she has raced. She just raced a couple weeks ago, now ships over and tries the Breeders' Cup. Is that Aidan O'Brien, to be honest, has been pretty terrible coming to the United States lately. I actually went and looked it up because I almost couldn't believe our stats on TimeformUS. He's lost 43 races in a row in North America. His last winner was Athena in the Belmont Oaks last July. And in the last 3 years, he's only 5 for 95. Now, Magical could be the exception. She obviously ran very well in the Breeders' Cup Turf last year when she was second behind Enable. So maybe she can break that spell, but I don't know if that's something I want to take a short price on. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of value in this race, but if you're looking to find some, maybe that's something you could pin your hopes on.
Well, the one thing I will say about that, because I agree with that stat, and I think Aidan O'Brien is a bet against in a lot of these North American races throughout the year. His record in the Breeders' Cup going back many years is much better than it is throughout the rest of the season. It seems like for races like the Belmont Derby and the Belmont Oaks and the Turf Classic or wherever he sends horses, he's just kind of taking a shot with his C string or his D string sometimes, trying to get some black type for these horses. When we get to the Breeders' Cup and he's actually sending horses over that are his A string or his B string, those horses seem like they're more intended to win these races. I mean, he's had real success in the Breeders' Cup. I know the percentages probably aren't high, but they're better than for the rest of the season. So I do want to put a slight asterisk on that stat, although I do agree with you that his overall record is not strong. The other concern I think with Magical is how she's going to handle a very firm turf course, because in last year's Breeders' Cup at Churchill Downs, I know the turf course was rated good. I mean, they were basically running over a bog that day, and she does seem to do well over that kind of going. She probably is going to be fine over firm turf. She seems like a pretty versatile horse. The 10 furlongs is not an issue at all. I think that might even be her best distance. I wonder how they're going to bet this race. Really, that's the thing I'm looking forward to see the most, because I could see an American wagering audience really going hard for Sister Charlie. And in my opinion, these two probably should be co-favorites, because I don't think Sister Charlie has some major edge over a really good European horse. I mean, you just look at Magical's one-time FormUS speed figure that she earned. That was a 131 in the Breeders' Cup Turf, and that's higher than anything Sister Charlie's ever earned in the U.S.
Yeah, no, like I said, I have no problem with her. Anything you said, you're 100% right about him pointing to the Breeders' Cup and being a little bit different. I was just looking if, you're looking for one edge. It is interesting to me that Thais is in the race, so we know there's going to be plenty of pace in here. As far as the others, I said I was trying to look for a price in each of these races. I couldn't really come up with one in here. The only thing I'd really say was if I was going to use anybody else besides those two, it would be other Euros. I wouldn't go with any of the other North American contingent in here. I just think it's a weak group. So I would definitely limit myself on this one if I'm playing horizontal bets.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'll admit right off the bat that I really have to do more of a look into the European contenders in this race. I'm familiar with them and I've watched their races. I just haven't really sorted it out and decided which ones that I prefer at this point in time. Though I agree with your assessment of the American horses. I just don't think they really stack up even against the lesser Euros that have come over for this race that are ranked behind Magical. Let's go back to the dirt and talk about a fascinating Breeders' Cup Sprint. This is one of the races I'm really looking forward to because you've got the right horses running in this race. The ones that were considering the dirt mile as well, they've really settled on the sprint, and I think it's a good thing for the quality of this race because the sprint really is the championship race. I mean, this is where you run to win the Eclipse Award for champion sprinter. You don't run in the dirt mile to win that Eclipse Award, and I think the horses that are vying for that award are in this race. Mitole, I think, is probably where you have to start. He's just been so good this year. His only loss has been that Vanderbilt where he was on the dead rail at Saratoga that really seemed to affect horses that went down there. So he's had a major excuse for one of those races. Other than that, he's just been brilliant. I think the only thing that really could undo him in this race is the trip.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think this race goes through Mitole and Imperial Hen. I think they're the two to beat. I think it's probably going to be the strongest field of the day. It is interesting, of the 11 horses, 5 do have a second preference in the dirt mile. So maybe some of these trainers will look at the PPs and think again, and maybe the field will shrink a little bit. But I'm looking forward to this just as much as you are. I love Mitole. I think he's fabulous. Same for Imperial Hen. He's taken another shot trying to win this race. I think it's his third try. He's run well in previous events, but hasn't been able to get the win. I'm a bit against Catalina Cruiser and Chancelot in here. Catalina Cruiser, I just don't think he's in quite as good a form as he was last year. He hasn't run as fast. And we saw what happened last year. He was basically a complete no-show at odds on in the dirt mile. And it was a one-turn mile similar to the sprint. So I'm not sure what to make of him. I know he's a local horse, but at an expected, he's not going to offer a whole lot of value. Chancelot, he looks like a one-race horse to me. He ran that big race at Saratoga, won off by the length of the stretch. I think it was the Alan Jerkins, or was it the one before that?
The Amsterdam.
Yeah, the Amsterdam. He didn't run quite as well in the Alan Jerkins. He shipped out to Santa Anita, had a clear lead, couldn't hold off Omaha Beach. So those are the two I'm against. I like Mitole and Imperial Hint, and I think one of those two is going to win the race.
Yeah, I don't want to give short shrift to Imperial Hint by leading with Mitole. I mean, I love Imperial Hint. I'm a huge fan of this horse. I thought he was just amazing in the Vanderbilt. I know that he was with the track that day, but I mean, still, that was one of the best sprinting performances that we've seen in the past half a decade. Probably only behind Chancelot's win the next day at Saratoga in the Amsterdam. But Imperial Hint, I don't want to hold the Vosburg against him last time. I know his speed figure dropped off a little bit in the Vosburg, but I mean, that was a race where he was kind of on the lead, probably not his best running style, and he sort of had to battle back towards the end after he got passed late. I think he can do better than that with a stalking trip. The real question for Imperial Hint is just, can he carry that form into the fall? Because we've seen in past years, sometimes he'll drop off at the end of the year after having a really strong summer campaign. Maybe the fact that they started him off late this year, coming back from Dubai, that's going to allow him to hold his form coming into the Breeders' Cup. I do think it's going to be a really fun matchup because the best efforts by each of these horses, I think, are very close to each other. I don't think Mitole has some huge advantage over the good version of Imperial Hint. So it's going to be fun to watch. And I agree with everything you said about Chancelot and Catalina Cruiser. As you know, I've never been a big fan of Catalina Cruiser. I just don't really see him as one of the top sprinters in the country. And as for Chancelot, his Santa Anita Sprint Championship, he ran okay. It's just kind of getting to be disappointing that he doesn't seem like the kind of horse that's going to run back to that explosive effort in the Amsterdam. I mean, he's not supposed to lose to a comeback in Omaha Beach last time. It's just, there's no two ways about it. So he's got to step forward to win this race, and it remains to be seen if he can. Really, it feels like the kind of race to me that could fall apart for third. So I don't want to totally discount a horse like maybe Whitmore picking up the pieces for the trifecta, but it really is about those top two for the first two positions, I would think.
Yeah, it will be interesting for the other positions. I did want to mention Diamond Oops. I'm not sure where I'd go with him. I'd probably go to the dirt mile just because I think he's in good form, but he has little chance in this race. But I'm really curious to see what this horse will do because he's run two real bang up races in a row. I know he got helped by the track a little bit in the Vanderbilt, but then when he went back to the turf, he ran really well in the Shadwell as well. So he's a horse I just kind of have my radar on. I'm curious to see how he does.
And he's one of those horses that could pick up pieces at the end of the race if a horse like Chancelot or Catalina Cruz are just, or even one of the top two, if they just don't run the race on this specific day and sort of fall apart at the end, because there is a lot of quality at the top. And if one of those horses doesn't show up, I think it's a little more wide open for those minor awards. Let's move on to the mile on the turf. And this is another fascinating race because it remains to be seen where some of these horses go. It sounds like Bricks and Mortar, who would be a big favorite in this race if he were to start. It sounds like his connections are definitely leaning towards the turf at this point. So assuming that he doesn't run, a lot of the main players in this mile are actually fillies. You've got Uni, who was so impressive in the First Lady last time. You've got Stormy, who set the track record in the 4-star David Saratoga. Disappointed a little bit in the Woodbine Mile last time, but I still think she's one of the major players. And you've got the Euros. What did you think of this race?
We're pretty similar here. I was going to say I'm assuming Bricks and Mortar is going to go in the turf. Just Wonderful was also entered, but she has first preference in the filly and mare turf, which she drew in. So I'm pretending like they're not going to be here. So the top two on the also eligible list will probably get in. But like you, I prefer the Euros and the North American females. That's just what I wrote in here. Uni, I think, ran just huge last time. I'm not real confident in the number that I gave her. It was an odd dynamic with the pace being so fast and it set up perfect. But I don't want to take anything away from her. It was still just a monster effort, in my opinion. And I agree with you about Got Stormy. Some people were disappointed in her Woodbine Mile. I think she was a bit too close to the pace that day. I think they're going to take her back off a little further than where she's run her best before. And I expect her to rebound and run big as well. The Euros, I'm going to have to take a closer look as you. The one that jumps out at me pretty quickly is Line of Duty. He won the juvenile turf here last year. He's in pretty good form. He's been running well in Group 1 and Group 2s back overseas. And I think he'll like the firm turf at Santa Anita. He's got good tactical speed, as we saw last year. So out of them, I think he's going to be a little bit of a price compared to some of the others like Circus Maximus, and he's the Euro I prefer as of now. But I'm sure I'll have more to come on that as the field takes shape and posts get drawn. But I'm with you. The North American males, I'm not particularly fond of. Maybe you could make a case for El Tormenta. He ran good in the Woodbine Mile, kind of took a really big step up. But he did have a perfect trip that day, so Euros and the females for me for now.
Yeah, I agree with that. And like you, I have to take a closer look at the European contenders to really put out some concrete opinions about them. Circus Maximus is probably the one that most people are going to focus on because he just does look so good over a flat mile in Europe this year, winning the Prix de Moulin du Longchamp last time and winning that St. James Palace over the summer. So his credentials are pretty strong for this race. Just remains to be seen how they can adapt to the California racing and how they work out trips in these races. The one thing I do want to say about this mile that we kind of glossed over was the pace situation, because just looking at, the pace projector for, I think there are 20 horses pre-entered for this race. It jumps out at you that there's not a fast pace predicted, and you go through this field. And I think none of the horses that are pre-entered for this race among the Americans have a running style of speed or leader. And there's really no speed in this race. The fact that Bolo and Ohm are predicted to be up front is just, that basically tells you all you need to know. So the one thing that would concern me about a horse like Uni, who comes from so far back, is that this might not be a race that features a very fast pace as Breeders' Cup miles go.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The other thing that interests me with the Euros is a lot of times we see their top ones that have been winning Group 1s come over here with Timeform ratings of 130, maybe a little higher, a little lower. But even a horse like Circus Maximus is only showing low 120s at best. Lines of Duty is similar, hasn't even hit the 120 mark. So I'm not sure it's quite as strong a Euro field as we've seen in the past based on the Timeform ratings. And we are going to get the write-up in our package from Jamie Lynch, who's moved on from Timeform. I think he works for Sky Sports now, but we do still have him working for us this year to give he gives really good analysis on every Euro shipper, and I highly recommend that. If for no other reason, if you want to buy the TimeformUS package, his analysis alone is probably worth the price, just because he has so much better insights than me or you are going to get from just watching replays. And not that you can't learn quite a bit that way, but he lives the races every year, as do some other people over there that will offer some good opinions. But I respect his as much as anybody else's, and I will definitely use some of his opinions to help form my own.
Yeah, let's be honest. Jamie puts us to shame. I mean, just reading his analysis, not only is he spot on with his opinion most of the time, but his prose is just so lovely to read, and the way that he kind of frames things and writes up these races and his assessment of the horses. It's just a fun thing to read through. So one of the highlights of the package, I would agree. Moving on to the Breeders' Cup Distaff, this is one of the races that really is centered around one particular horse, and that is, of course, Midnight Bisou. She's sort of a fringe contender for Horse of the Year, depending on how the other races shake out and depending on whether or not she can win this Breeders' Cup Distaff. I mean, if she wins this race, she would complete an 8-for-8 season, which is just really remarkable. She never wins by that much, but she gets the job done. And with the way this field is coming up, I mean, this race really is all about her.
It is. She's clearly the horse to beat. She's a really tricky read for a speed figure guy like me, because like you said, she's a horse who never really just draws away and crushes the field. I mean, she won last time by 3 over Wildcat. It's probably her biggest margin on the year or close to it. She's a mare now, or no, she's a filly, 4-year-old, who started her season off at Sam Houston and back in January, and she's still going, hasn't had any real breaks. She's going to be an obviously short price. So the question becomes, do you want to take a shot against her? I'm probably going to be, feel silly afterwards for doing it, but I imagine I will, just because I don't think she has the edge that the odds are going to indicate she does. I won't be shocked in the least if she, makes her patented run and gets up and wins this race by a head. But I might take a shot with a couple others in here. I mentioned early Serengeti Empress. I think she's going to be clear speed in this field. Maybe she can replicate her Kentucky Oaks. I think she's a better horse than she was when she won that race. Like I said, her last race, I mentioned that Cotillion, I think is a race for her. You can kind of put a line through. It was just way too fast. There was way too much speed in there. It was really predictable. I mean, I think we both kind of nailed that race when we did our forecast back then. But I think she's just going to get a much easier trip in here. And I'm not ready to write off the Dunbar Road either. I thought she ran pretty well on her first shot at Keeneland. I didn't particularly love her trip that day. The rail might not have been the best place to be. She was kind of bottled up. And I thought she ran well, pretty well in that spot also. One I would take a shot against is Street Band for similar reasons that I kind of like Serengeti Empress a little in here, is that I just think she had the dream trip of her life last time. She's a solid enough filly for sure, but I don't think she's going to get that kind of trip, and she's probably going to be overbet off of it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about this race is that once you do get past Midnight Bisou, if you've kind of gotten to a point where you're willing to take a shot against her, you do have a lot of options among the rest of the field. It's not like you're boxed into one or two alternatives. There are many to consider. We should just briefly mention Elate, who's pre-entered for this race. I mean, she's almost a certainty to run in the Classic. Bill Mott has made that very clear. So I'm not really going to touch upon her. But yeah, I agree with your assessment of the 3-year-olds. I do think Serengeti Empress is a horse that you have to consider just because she's going to have that clear lead. I mean, the pace projector shows that. There's just no other confirmed front runner in the race. I don't know if she's quite good enough. I don't know if she's going to pull off that feat going 1.1 miles against the top older horses, but I wouldn't totally count her out. I like Dunbar Road. I agree that the rail was probably not the place to be in the Spinster. And she seems like one of those few that still has that ability to take another step forward. I don't think we've seen the best of her just yet. So I would use her. I mean, Blue Prize, she's always right there. I would definitely include her in exotics. I don't know if she's really a winning type, although she did get the job done in the Spinster last time. I mean, the other horse that I would just mention among the local horses is Paradise Woods. I know she's not your favorite horse and you've got some issues with her, but she did get back on track last time in the Zenyatta. And the key with her is getting that forward trip with nobody in front of her and not taking dirt in her face. And with not a lot of speed in this race, depending on how the post positions work out, I could see her in a situation where she's just stalking Serengeti Empress. And she does have it in her to run the kind of speed figure that puts her in the mix to win the race.
Yeah, I don't really have any problem with Paradise Woods. She did run well last time. She certainly fooled me. I didn't like her in that spot, but I still think she's probably a little over her head. I'd like her more if there was not as much speed in here. I mean, not that there's a lot of speed, but I should say if there was not any other speed in here, she may get that stalking trip off of Serengeti Empress. But the problem is, even when Serengeti Empress goes to the lead and is clear, she's not setting a slow pace. So if you're chasing her, you're chasing a pace. And I think that'll probably be her undoing, but I wouldn't knock anybody for using her. It's her home track. She'll probably run well. Santa Anita has really been favoring speed. I wrote up some stats for Mark Milligan of Timeform, and I was surprised looking at it, just how deadly speed has been since the track reopened. Granted, it's not a huge sample size because they're not running a lot of races. They're running a lot of turf races on the cards they do run at Santa Anita, but speed has been deadly, so I would be careful using deep closers in here.
That's interesting. I think you do want to pay attention to that stuff with the Breeders' Cup out in California. Also pay attention to how the track is playing the week of the race, because sometimes on these big days, we do see the track change quite a bit before the actual Breeders' Cup card. So just be aware of that as well. And we'll see how they maintain the track given the current climate around racing out in California right now. Maybe that won't be the case this year, but we'll see how things play out next week. But I do think it's worth paying attention to that kind of stuff. Let's move back to the turf and discuss the final turf race they'll run at the Breeders' Cup, the Breeders' Cup turf, going the 1.5 miles. And we're going to find out probably who the top horse of the year candidate is in these 3 consecutive races to end the Breeders' Cup, the Distaff, the Turf, and the Classic, because you've got that second major horse of the year candidate, Bricks and Mortar, in action in the turf. It's likely that he's running in this race and not the mile. And well, first of all, what do you think about this decision? I know we've gone back and forth about this, which is the right race for him, the mile or the turf. I am leaning towards the turf. I think the turf, just for the horse, forgetting the competition for a second, it's probably the right race to run in to try to win the Eclipse Award. How do you see it?
I agree that it's probably the right race to run in. If it was my horse, which would never happen, I could never afford a horse like this. This would be the race I would choose, because if he wins it, he's probably the favorite for horse of the year, regardless of what happens in the Classic. That said, Chad Brown has been really reluctant to stretch his horse out. This is a 12 furlong race. He's never even gone beyond 10. There's been plenty of chances to try 11. So as a bettor, I'm going to be really skeptical of him in here. If he beats me, fine. But this is a day where I don't want to take short prices on horses that have some major questions to answer. And I think for him, this is definitely one. I have to trust in Chad Brown. He's the top trainer in the game, definitely the top turf trainer here in North America. And if he's been skeptical all this time, it feels like more he's just taking a shot than he really believes this horse wants the distance.
Well, I think one of the reasons that they've been so careful is that they have the opportunity to, because as you were saying, he's in such a great position with the horse of the year, in the horse of the year picture, that really he just has to win one of these 2 races to be horse of the year. And I think they're just choosing which is the one that they're probably have a better chance of winning. And I'm not going to argue that might be the turf. As for the 1.5 mile distance, I mean, I've talked about his pedigree in the past. His pedigree says it's going to be no problem, because there is a ton of European stamina breeding in the dam side, especially going down to the second generation. So he's supposed to be okay going the distance just based on what his breeding says. And also, it's out in California. We're probably going to have a nice day. It's going to be a firm turf course in all likelihood. And sometimes going the 1.5 miles on that Santa Anita turf course, it's a little easier on these horses than going 1.5 miles at let's say, Keeneland or Belmont. It's not quite as much of a test of stamina. I mean, heck, we saw Little Mike win the Breeders' Cup Turf out in California. So, I mean, a horse who's not really a 1.5 mile horse can do it. So I think that works in his favor a little bit. But it's not like this is going to be some easy test, because there are a lot of Euros coming over that are pretty good. I mean, Magical is probably running in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf, but I mean, her stablemate Anthony Van Dyke, He's a nice horse. I know he lost her in the Champion Stakes last time, but he's more of a 1.5 mile type as a winner of the Epsom Derby. I mean, Old Persian's an interesting horse coming off that win in the Northern Dancer. He looked so good in Dubai this winter. There are plenty of others to consider. So I think this is a race where Bricks and Mortar is a horse to respect, but look at the other options from a wagering standpoint.
Yeah, that's kind of my point. I'm definitely not going to be singling a horse like Bricks and Mortar in here. Anthony Van Dyke, you mentioned, won the Epsom Derby earlier this year. He's in pretty good form. He was only 2 lengths behind Magical. She would obviously, I would think she would be the favorite if she showed up here after a runner-up performance last year in her good form. So he's certainly one to contend with. I like both of the horses that ran at Gulfstream recently, Woodbine, I mean. Old Persian ran very well, as you mentioned. He didn't beat a whole lot that day. I mean, Nessie was back in second, but he didn't start great, and I think he ran very well he just did what he had to do. He got a good figure that day. And I actually like the race from Alanak, who ran second in the Canadian International. The pace wasn't much. He wasn't able to catch Desert Encounter, but I thought he ran pretty well to get up and be within a half length of him. So I think all of these shippers are looking pretty good and could give Bricks and Mortar all he wants. As far as the American contingent goes, I don't want to knock our horses too much, but this is probably the weakest division we have, and I think it would be a shock if any of those horses were to win outside of Bricks and Mortar.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think a lot of the Euros would have to not show up for one of the Americans other than Bricks and Mortar to win the race. We'll see how all of that shakes out. I mean, it doesn't even seem like the kind of race you're going to steal in the front end, because there are a couple of speed horses in this race, Acclimate and Bandua, who probably would be helping to ensure that the pace is at least honest. So I do think you'll see a fairly run race. And if the best horse wins, it's probably not one of those second string American runners. All right.
Yeah, one thing I do want to mention before we move on is they will start this race on the hill. I know they've gotten rid of the 6.5 furlong down the hill races at Santa Anita, but the 10 furlongs, they do use some of the hill. It's not quite as long as the sprints that they used to run there, but it is definitely significant. And as you mentioned earlier, it kind of impacts the distance of the race. When you run part of it downhill, you're really not going the full 1.5 miles.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I meant to mention that earlier. It does make it, I think, a little easier on these horses that have some stamina limitations. All right, let's move on to the Breeders' Cup Classic, the last race we're going to talk about, the last race of the Breeders' Cup. And it's as wide open as we've seen in the Classic in years, because you have the probable favorite, McKinsey, but it's not like he lays over this field. His best race probably gets the job done, but there are some questions about his current form. There are some questions about the 1.25 miles. There are some questions about the trip, because this race has a bit of a murky pace situation. How do you see it? Is McKinsey the horse to beat? Are you taking a shot against him?
I'm definitely taking a shot against him. I wasn't a fan of his last race. I'm not a fan of him going 10 furlongs. I know he changed riders, so I expect maybe a little bit more aggressive ride this time than what we've gotten. But I'm sure you probably remember a while back on the pace cast, I predicted a 3-year-old was going to win this race. So I'm going to stick with that. I think they're a strong group. There's 4 of them in here. Code of Honor is clearly probably the one in the best form right now. But I'm not knocking the others either. I think Owendale, who ran the Oklahoma Derby here at Remington, is in really good form. I think Math Wizard is not totally out of the question. And surprisingly enough, the one I would really dismiss out of all of them is War of Will. Since his Preakness, I don't think he's been in very good form, but even him, I don't think he's without a shot. When you look at the older horses, like I said, McKinsey, it's hard to like him at a short price for me. Again, it's the Breeders' Cup. Some favorites are going to win, but they're usually not going to be the horses I'm backing. I think there are distance questions with him. If I was going to pick an older horse, it would probably be Vino Rosso, who should have won the Jockey Club Gold Cup. I don't want to get into that DQ thing too much. I was really surprised he was. I just wonder if he'll have that same tactical advantage where he'll be able to make the lead in a field like this. I think that was probably what helped him in the Jockey Club Gold Cup. But he has proven to like 1.25 miles, so the distance is right up his alley. And then you kind of come back to Elite. I know a lot of people are kind of giving Bill Mott a hard time, saying she can't beat fillies. Why try her here? But the distance is certainly what she wants, I think. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I'd probably do the same thing he's doing. I think she has a better shot in here than she does against Midnight Bisou and others again. So I'm not saying I love her here. I certainly don't, but I don't think she's without a chance either.
Yeah, I think it's a wide open race, and all of the horses you mentioned, I think they have a decent shot in here. Maybe with the exception of Mathwizard, I'm not quite as high on him, but I mean they're all very interesting. I mostly agree with what you said about McKenzie. I have some questions about the distance. At his best, he's the most talented horse in this race, and I don't want to totally dismiss it if I'm playing multi-race wagers. It's not like I'm going to just completely throw him out, but I do think this is a race where you have a lot of other options at better prices. I really think Vino Rosso, I'm not saying I'm picking him, but I think he's a strong contender in this race. He's come around at the end of this year, and he's always been best going these longer distances, and I think he's really shown it in the Santa Anita Gold Cup and the Jockey Club Gold Cup that he just loves 1.25 miles. And you can't say that about everybody in this race. He's got that improved tactical speed. He did well with the blinkers off last time. Won't get into the DQ, but he ran an excellent race that day. I think Vino Rosso is a really strong contender because you might look at him and say, well, he's a little bit slow compared to a usual Breeders' Cup Classic winner, but how fast does he really have to run to win this race if McKenzie doesn't come up with his day effort? So I think Vino Rosso makes a lot of sense. I don't think Code of Honor is impossible. I don't know that Shug McGahee is in love with the idea of running in this race, but I think he's a horse that's in good form and has to be used. Elate is a difficult call for me because on one hand, I know it's not the strongest Breeders' Cup Classic, and maybe this is a better spot for her. On the other hand, she's a filly facing the boys. They tend to get overbet. If she's going to be around 5 or 6 to 1, I wouldn't want her. If she's going to be 10 or 12 to 1, well, then maybe that's a little bit interesting. So I think with Elate, it really just depends on the price. And I mean, the other 3-year-olds, I think Owendale, who you mentioned, I liked his race in the Oklahoma Derby last time. I think 1.25 miles is okay for him. So he's one I would consider. And I don't want to totally discount Mongolian Groom either. I know he was a surprise in the Awesome Again last time, but he earned a pretty nice speed figure that day, and he's shown in the past he can get 1.25 miles. Just says there are a lot of horses that can win this race.
Yeah, it's as you mentioned, this race isn't really the quality we've seen most years, but it really is a great betting race. Whatever your opinion's going to be, you're probably going to get paid if you're right. The one horse I'm kind of against in here that might take some money is Yoshida. I think a lot of people look at him and just think he's a horse that wants 1.25 miles, but I thought he was really disappointing last time, and he's done that often where he just doesn't back up decent races. He ran well in the Whitney, and just he couldn't even beat Preservationist and Bow Harbor, 2 horses who didn't even see fit to bother trying in a race like this. So if I had to pick one horse that might take some money to totally toss out, it would be Yoshida.
Yeah, and the one other thing to mention about this race that does kind of impact Yoshida is that this is not one of those Breeders' Cup Classics that projects to feature a fast pace. Just looking at the pace projector, it's not a fast pace predicted, and looking at the horse's running styles, there's really no confirmed front runner in here. And Yoshida's a horse that just drops right out the back of the pack, so it's going to be tough for him to pass them all in a race that is not really predicted to be, or they're not predicted to be flying up front, especially if the Santa Anita racetrack is playing to speed. I think that just works against a horse like Yoshida. You do want to have some tactical speed in a race like this, and maybe that advantage is McKenzie, but he still has to show up and do it and get the trip. So those are all.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Yeah, before we wrap it up, I wouldn't even be surprised to see Elate fairly up close. That's how little pace is in here. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to these. I should mention one other thing I noticed is how slow the Santa Anita track has been playing. This is not the Santa Anita of 2 or 3 years ago even, and it's been even slower than it was before the break that they had earlier this year when they came back. And I just want to say a slow track doesn't always translate to good for closers. I think what's been happening out there is the kick of the late runners has been getting sapped. So just whoever kind of gets the lead kind of hangs on through the stretch. And this has been going whether you go short or long. So it will be interesting to monitor the track. I'll certainly be talking about it on Twitter in this upcoming week. So those that follow me can kind of follow along, and I'll put how fast the track is and see if there's any changes to it. But just wanted to make that point that just because the times aren't what we're used to seeing out at Santa Anita, don't interpret that to mean that it doesn't help speed, because it's actually been quite the opposite.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that in some of the prep races. I know some people were not that impressed with the way horses were coming home, especially with the 2-year-old races. I mean, 8 Rings changing lead and not looking like he was really flying home at the end of the American Pharoah. But I think a lot of that and the visual impact of those races really has to do with just how slow and deep the track is. So I think that's a really good point, and I'll definitely be looking for your thoughts on that as we get into next week. Craig, good to talk about these races with you. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We're not going to do any podcasts next week. This will be the last you'll hear from us, or at least hear our voices before the Breeders' Cup. As always, you can check out our opinions in the TimeformUS Breeders' Cup package, which we mentioned at the top of the show. But we'll return with the typical recap show after the Breeders' Cup, and we'll look back at all the Breeders' Cup races the Tuesday over a week from now. So we'll be back then. But Craig, good to talk about these races with you. As always, you can listen to the TimeformUS Pacecast and the TimeformUS Forecast on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Just subscribe to the Daily Racing Form. So thanks for listening this week, everybody. Good luck at the Breeders' Cup, and we'll catch up with you in over a week.